In the city of Lagos lived Mr. Adebayo. He never smiled, he never laughed, but his arrival each morning was a spectacle. Wearing his neatly pressed khaki shirt and a black cap tilted slightly to the side, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth. Other drivers greeted him with respect. Mr. Adebayo. Every driver in the park knew of him. Every passenger wanted to ride with him. Mr. Adebayo wasn't just a driver. He was a legend, a man with silver hair and steady hands who had never had an accident in over 30 years of driving the treacherous Lagos-Abuja route. Chairman, Baba Wa. They hailed, giving him way as he passed. Adebayo would respond with a curt nod, his eyes already scanning his vehicle for the day. His Toyota coaster bus gleamed like polished ivory, its tires as spotless as the reputation of the man behind the wheel. His journeys were nothing short of remarkable. On one particularly foggy morning, when even seasoned drivers hesitated to venture onto the expressway, Mr. Adebayo had a full busload of passengers waiting anxiously. The fog was so thick that visibility was reduced to mere meters ahead. The other drivers muttered among themselves, shaking their heads. "Nobody can drive in this weather," one muttered, leaning against his car. But Adebayo was undeterred. With a calm expression, he climbed into the driver's seat, adjusted his mirrors, and said, "Sit tight. We'll get there safe." The bus hummed to life, and Adebayo navigated the treacherous route with an uncanny precision. Where others would have been blinded by the fog, he seemed to possess a sixth sense, guiding the bus around sharp bends and potholes as though the road itself whispered directions to him. Passengers, initially tense and wide-eyed, soon relaxed as they realized they were in the hands of a master. By the time they reached Abuja without a single mishap, the entire bus erupted in applause. This man is a magician," one passenger exclaimed in awe. But it wasn't magic. It was pure skill, honed over decades of experience. On another occasion, Mr. Adebayo's prowess was tested by a reckless trailer driver who suddenly swerved into his lane along the Lokoja highway. Passengers gasped in horror as the massive vehicle loomed dangerously close, its horn blaring like a war trumpet. Without breaking a sweat, Adebayo downshifted, veering the bus onto the shoulder with a fluid motion that seemed almost effortless. The trailer roared past, missing them by mere inches. You are very good, sir," a woman exclaimed, clutching her chest in relief. Adebayo simply nodded, his grip on the steering wheel firm and unshaken. "You just have to respect the road," he said quietly. His driving was a blend of intuition, patience, and sheer brilliance. While others relied on brute force and aggressive tactics, Adebayo danced with the road, treating it like an old friend whose quirks he knew intimately. Passengers trusted him implicitly, even on the most harrowing trips. Mothers traveling with children would relax and sleep, knowing they were safe. Businessmen with tight schedules would breathe easier, confident they'd arrive on time. There was a running joke among drivers in the park. If Adebayo is driving, the road gives way. But beneath the admiration and respect lay a mystery that no one dared to question. Why did he forbid prayer in his bus? Some said it was superstition. Others whispered of a strange encounter he once had on the road. But no one knew for sure. And Mr. Adebayo, ever enigmatic, never offered an explanation, until that fateful journey with Oluchi and her daughter, Chiamaka, when the truth would finally unravel. Oluchi wiped the sweat from her brow as she navigated the crowded Balagan market with her 8-year-old daughter, Chiamaka, holding her. The child clung tightly to her mother's hand, her curious eyes darting between colorful stalls and bustling traders shouting their wares. Oluchi was a striking woman in her early 30s, with deep brown skin and eyes that carried both warmth and resilience. Life had not been easy for her, but she wore her struggles like a badge of honor. After the sudden collapse of her tailoring business during a prolonged economic downturn, she had made a tough decision to join her husband, Emeka, who had secured a promising job with an engineering firm in Abuja. They had been apart for nearly a year, communicating only through late-night phone calls and sporadic video chats. Emeka had wanted them to join him months ago, but Oluchi, ever the practical woman, insisted on waiting until she could save enough for a comfortable relocation. That day had finally come. As they maneuvered through the market to purchase last-minute travel snacks, Oluchi glanced down at Chiamaka. The girl had inherited her father's bright smile, and her mother's stubborn determination. Chia, are you ready for our adventure? Oluchi asked, forcing a smile despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Chiamaka beamed, her small teeth gleaming. Yes, Mum. Daddy said he's waiting to see how much I've grown. Oluchi chuckled softly. Well, you'll have plenty of stories to tell him. The truth was, Oluchi had mixed feelings about the journey. Lagos had been her home for years, a place where she had built friendships and memories despite its challenges. But Abuja promised a fresh start, stability for her daughter, a chance to reunite her family, and hopefully a better life. By the time they reached the driver's park at Ojota, the early morning hustle was already in full swing. Buses lined up in uneven rows, their drivers shouting destinations. Abuja, Benin, Lokoja, one more space remaining. The smell of engine oil mingled with the aroma of akara frying in makeshift stalls nearby. Oluchi tightened her grip on Chiamaka's hand as they weaved through the throng of travelers and hawkers. Her eyes scanned the buses, looking for a reputable driver. The stories of reckless driving and tragic accidents haunted her mind. A scrawny man with a toothpick dangling from his mouth approached them. Madam Abuja, he asked eagerly. My bus day front. Correct driver, no shaking. Oluchi shook her head politely and kept moving. She wasn't one to take chances, especially not with her child. Then she saw him, a tall man with silver-streaked hair standing beside a pristine white Toyota coaster bus. He radiated a quiet authority, his khaki shirt crisp despite the humid weather. Other drivers greeted him with deference, calling him Chairman and Baba. That must be Mr. Adebayo, Oluchi murmured to herself. She had heard whispers about him from friends who frequently traveled. He was said to be the best driver on the Lagos-Abuja route, meticulous, skilled, and dependable. This is our bus, she decided aloud, leading Chiamaka toward it. Chiamaka tugged at her hand. Mama, is this driver nice? Oluchi smiled faintly. If he's as good as people say, we'll be in safe hands. As they approached, Mr. Adebayo glanced at them briefly before nodding toward the bus door. Abuja? He asked in a tone that was more statement than question. Yes, Oluchi confirmed. You're in the right place, he said simply, gesturing for them to board. The bus was nearly full, with passengers settling into their seats and stowing their belongings. Oluchi guided Chiamaka to a window seat near the middle. As they waited for departure, Chiamaka leaned toward her mother and whispered, Mama, can I pray before we go? Oluchi smiled warmly. Of course, my dear. Always pray. As the bus rumbled to life, Chiamaka clasped her hands and whispered, Jesus, please take the wheel as we go. Adebayo's ears perked up, and he turned sharply. Madam, control your child, he barked. No praying on my bus. Don't try it. You and daughter will get down from this bus now. Startled, Adora replied softly. She was just praying, sir. He pointed to a sign above the windshield that read, No praying allowed. I carry people of all religions, and I don't want anyone offended, he explained curtly. Adora nodded, pulling Chiamaka close. But a sense of unease settled over her. It was a simple prayer, innocent and heartfelt. But neither Oluchi nor Chiamaka could have known that those words would soon set in motion a journey unlike any they had ever imagined. Mr. Adebayo drove outside the park to the hailing of the Agbaros in the park, who asked him to tip them before he set out on the journey. The clamor of Ojota Park gradually faded as Mr. Adebayo's bus rumbled onto the expressway, merging smoothly with the chaotic morning traffic. The rhythmic hum of the engine filled the air, soothing passengers into silence. Lagos stretched behind them like a fading memory, its dense bustle giving way to the vast, dusty expanse of the highway leading to Abuja. Oluchi leaned back in her seat, grateful for the cool breeze wafting through the half-open windows. Chiamaka, beside her, was wide-eyed, excited by the new sights. She pressed her nose to the glass, marveling at the endless stream of vehicles and occasional roadside vendors hawking roasted plantains and bottles of water. Mr. Adebayo sat upright behind the wheel, his expression calm but focused. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of a man who had traveled this road countless times. Passengers whispered among themselves or settled in for naps, lulled by the gentle sway of the bus. A wiry man sitting near the front was the first to break the silence. Driver, play some music please. The passengers chuckled. Mr. Adebayo glanced at the man through the rearview mirror and shook his head. No music, he said firmly. We focus on the road. Oluchi smiled faintly. She appreciated his seriousness. There were too many reckless drivers who treated long-distance trips like joyrides. About an hour into the journey, the road opened up, free of the congestion that plagued Lagos traffic. The smooth asphalt stretched ahead like an invitation. Mr. Adebayo's driving was impeccable. He glided past slower vehicles with graceful precision, never once jerking the bus or making passengers uneasy. Chiamaka, Oluchi whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face. You doing okay? Chiamaka nodded enthusiastically. Mama, this road is so big. Is this how Abuja roads look too? Maybe even better, Oluchi said with a chuckle. As they continued, the landscape changed. The urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and patches of green farmland. The sky, now a brilliant blue, stretched endlessly above them. A faint breeze carried the scent of earth and wildflowers through the windows. Mr. Adebayo expertly navigated around potholes and overtook sluggish trucks hauling cement and livestock. Passengers murmured in awe when he narrowly avoided a reckless driver who swerved into their lane. Ah, Baba, you are too much, a young man at the back exclaimed. Experience, Mr. Adebayo replied tersely, eyes never leaving the road. The journey seemed smooth and uneventful until they reached a particularly desolate stretch of the highway near Kogi State. The road was eerily quiet, flanked by thick bushes on either side. Even the usual roadside hawkers were nowhere to be seen. Oluchi felt a sudden unease prickling at her senses. She glanced at Mr. Adebayo, who appeared unperturbed, his face stoic as ever. Then it happened. The sun had begun its slow descent as Mr. Adebayo's bus sped along the near-empty highway. The rhythmic thrum of the engine, combined with the gentle swaying of the vehicle, lulled most of the passengers into a peaceful slumber. Heads lolled against windows, while others snored softly. But not Oluchi. She sat upright, her senses prickling with unease. The ride had been smooth, almost too smooth. Chiamaka, nestled against her mother's side, was unusually alert for a child who normally dozed off on long trips. Her bright eyes darted nervously from the passing landscape to the steering wheel at the front of the bus. Mama, she whispered, why is everyone sleeping? Oluchi glanced around. Every other passenger, including the boisterous young men who had been chatting earlier, had succumbed to an unnatural sleep. Even the woman who had been feeding her baby just minutes ago now sat with her head tilted back, mouth slightly open, as though under a spell. A chill crept down Oluchi's spine. I don't know, my dear, she said quietly, but stay close to me. At the wheel, Mr. Adebayo's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. His usually calm demeanor had been replaced by a tense, rigid expression. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool evening breeze. The bus shuddered violently, as though something unseen had gripped its frame. Oluchi gasped, clutching Chiamaka tightly. The vehicle veered slightly to the right before stabilizing, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. Mr. Adebayo's hands had left the steering wheel. Instead of chaos, however, the bus continued moving smoothly, almost as though it were being guided by an unseen force. Oluchi's breath caught in her throat as she followed her daughter's wide-eyed gaze. Writhing around the steering wheel was a snake, long, glistening, and impossibly black. Its coils shimmered under the dim light inside the bus, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red hue. The serpent slithered effortlessly around the wheel, guiding the vehicle as though it were the driver. Oluchi's voice trembled. Chiamaka, don't look. But Chiamaka couldn't tear her gaze away. Mama, the snake is driving. Mr. Adebayo turned abruptly, his face pale and slick with sweat. His voice cracked with desperation. Why are you awake? I told you not to pray. See what you've caused. The snake disappeared immediately. Oluchi's heart raced. What are you talking about? What is this madness? His voice wavered as he spoke, almost incoherent. They always sleep, every single one of them. But you and your child now were lost. We're on a journey of no return. Only the snake knows where we are now. Chiamaka clung to her mother, trembling. Mama, we have to pray. No, Mr. Adebayo shouted, his voice raw with fear. No praying. Don't make it worse. Oluchi's eyes narrowed. Worse? What do you mean? What's happening? The bus lurched again, The landscape outside had shifted into something surreal. Twisted trees with blackened branches, a road that seemed to stretch endlessly without any recognizable landmarks. We're in their world now, Mr. Adebayo sobbed. The snake, it's part of the deal. I didn't want this. I only wanted an easier life. More trips, no fatigue. That professor, he promised. Oluchi's voice was steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. What professor? The man I carried years ago, Adebayo confessed, his voice breaking. He said he'd make my job easier. Gave me oil to anoint the bus every day. Said I'd never be tired, never have accidents. And it worked, until now. Now he's coming for me. As if on cue, a gust of icy wind swept through the bus. The sleeping passengers stirred slightly, but did not wake. Shadows danced unnaturally along the windows. Then, from nowhere, a man appeared in the middle of the road. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a black suit, his face obscured by darkness despite the fading daylight. His presence radiated malevolence, twisting the very air around him. Mr. Adebayo's voice cracked in terror. It's him, the professor. The figure raised a hand, and the bus ground to a sudden halt, throwing passengers forward in their seats. The snake around the wheel hissed violently before vanishing into thin air. The professor stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the asphalt. His eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory light as he pointed directly at Mr. Adebayo. You broke the terms of our agreement, he said, his voice smooth but dripping with menace. Now you must pay. Mr. Adebayo collapsed into his seat, sobbing uncontrollably. Please, please. Oluchi felt a surge of defiance rise within her. She had seen enough. Whatever this was, she refused to let fear claim her or her daughter. Chiamaka, with a trembling but determined voice, began to recite Psalm 121. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. The professor flinched, his expression darkening. Stop that, he commanded, his voice reverberating like thunder. But Chiamaka continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. Oluchi joined her, their voices merging into a powerful declaration of faith. Suddenly, the oppressive darkness lifted. The twisted landscape outside the bus began to dissolve, replaced by familiar sights, trees, the open highway, and the fading orange glow of the setting sun. The professor snarled, his form flickering like a fading shadow. This isn't over, he hissed before vanishing into thin air. Silence enveloped the bus. Mr. Adebayo sat motionless, his chest heaving. We're back, he whispered hoarsely. I know this road. Oluchi placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. God brought us back, she said firmly. And it's time you come clean and make things right. As the passengers stirred awake, oblivious to the supernatural ordeal they had just survived, Mr. Adebayo knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. By the time they reached Abuja, the atmosphere in the bus had transformed. What had begun as a tense, fearful journey ended with hearts full of gratitude and renewed faith. Adebayo, humbled by the experience, gathered the passengers before they disembarked. I have something to confess, he said solemnly. For years, I relied on things I shouldn't have. But today, I learned that only God can truly guide us safely. Oluchi smiled warmly. And now you know the power of prayer. From that day forward, Mr. Adebayo became a different man. He no longer forbade prayer in his bus. In fact, he encouraged it. His passengers knew him not just as the best driver in the park, but as a man who carried the Spirit of God in his heart. And every journey he embarked on began with these words, Jesus, take the wheel. The story of Mr. Adebayo spread far and wide, inspiring countless drivers and passengers alike. His testimony became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even the most skilled among us are nothing without divine guidance. Oluchi and Chiamaka returned to Lagos with hearts full of joy, knowing they had played a part in leading a man back to the light. And as for the professor, no one ever saw him again. But Adebayo knew one thing for sure. No darkness could ever stand against the power of God. Hey guys, for more interesting folktales like this, please like, share, and subscribe to support our channel.